Welcome to today's episode titled Adam Osborne, the Computer Tycoon I'd Never Heard of. And today's episode, it came about because of a random article I stumbled upon. It mentioned something called the Osborne effect. So I thought, okay, what's this? I'd never heard of it. I Googled it. And it turns out it's this social phenomenon. Basically, it's what happens when a company announces a new product too early and customers who are about to buy that company's current product, they cancel their orders because they want to wait for the new product. And as a result, the company's sales and cash flow just plummets. And the term comes from the Osborne Computer Corporation, which ran into this problem. So, of course, I was asking myself, okay, what's Osborne Computer Company? I'd never heard of it, thinking I'd get a very short answer and move on. But it turns out that it was founded by a guy called Adam Osborne, who was one of the most influential and, for a while, a very brief while, one of the most successful people in the computer business in the late 70s and early 80s. David Bunnell, who is the publisher behind PC World, PC Magazine, Macworld, he said, there were three major people in the industry: Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, and Adam Osborne, and not necessarily in that order. So that, of course, got me very intrigued. Now, I know an awful lot of tech people are probably throwing their eyes up thinking, how had I never heard of Adam Osborne? But look, I'm a business nerd, I'm not a tech nerd, and I was only about 8 years old when Osborne's very brief career burned brightest. So I'd never come across him. Surprising, yeah, but I'm glad I did. Before we dig into it, a quick reminder. While these shorter weekly episodes, released every Wednesday, are free for everyone, for just $1.99 a month, you get access to our co-hosted hour-long episodes released on the first of every month, where Keith and I do an even deeper dive into an incredible business story. Some of these hour-long episodes are still free in our back catalogue, so you can get a taste of what to expect. As well as getting access to these monthly co-hosted hour-long plus episodes, behind the paywall right now is a fantastic 3-part series on Disney. And over the coming months, we'll be adding more bonus content for subscribers regularly. Also, subscribers will get access to these weekly episodes ad-free, so you won't have to listen to me talk about our subscriber program. So it's great value for just $1.99 a month. You can subscribe via Apple subscriptions, Spotify subscriptions, or on Patreon using the link below, or go to patreon.com/Great Business Stories. So getting back to Adam Osborne. He was born in March 1939 in Bangkok, Thailand, to British parents, but during World War II, he and his mother went off to southern India for a few years, and then in 1950, the family moved back to England. Osborne graduated with a degree in chemical engineering from the University of Birmingham, and according to his sister Katia, and I quote, his interests seemed to constantly shift. A fascination with poetry gave way to science. Science gave way to engineering. Adam wanted to understand and master it all. And that kind of sums up his character. He was always curious, always on the move to the next big thing, and incredibly intelligent. Now, after graduating, he moved to America. He enrolled in the University of Delaware, where he got a PhD in chemical engineering. But during his studies, he taught himself computer programming to speed up his research. So he was into computers very, very early on. And after leaving university, he joined Shell, the oil company. And they initially had him on this fast-track program. But after only 2 years, they told him he'd only have a mediocre career if he stayed. That must have been some assessment meeting. I mean, he was on this fast track. He was a star within Shell, and then all of a sudden he was told he was only going to have a mediocre career. I couldn't find out why. I'm guessing it's because Osborne did have this kind of brash personality. Maybe he rubbed people up the wrong way. Who knows? But according to Osborne, it was a wake-up call. As he said, that forced my hand. That's when I said to myself, don't go out and get another job with another company. Do it yourself. And that's what he did. So he started to focus on what really interested him, and that was computers and technical writing. Because this is at a time where computers were becoming crucial for business and science and all other sectors. But Osborne realised there wasn't really a whole lot there in the way of accessible documentation that could explain computers to people, and he saw a big opportunity there. So he launched Osborne and Associates in 1972, and it specialised in easy to read computing manuals, and it quickly became the go-to publisher for books on home and business computing. But what really made Osborne stand out from the crowd was that he wrote a regular column called From the Fountainhead in a magazine called Interface Age, which was a big computer magazine back then. And it was in these pieces that he really made a name for himself, because he wasn't shy about taking shots at major computer companies. And he became known as the original cranky computer columnist, and his influence on the industry was undeniable. He was one of the star columnists in the computer business, and it was a great time to be in that business, because 1972 it was ground zero for the personal computer. Remember, at that time, Apple and Microsoft hadn't even been founded. Microsoft came along in 1975 with Bill Gates and Paul Allen. Apple came around in 1976, founded by Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak, and Ronald Wayne. And again, I'll admit my ignorance here, I never knew about Ronald Wayne until I read the Walter Isaacson book on Steve Jobs. To me, and I read much about Apple up until then, it was always just the two Steves. So that was an interesting find. But anyway, the personal computer sector was really just starting to take shape in 1972. And some groundbreaking developments happened in that year. So Intel introduced the 8008 or the 8008 processor, I'm not too sure, in 72, and this was the first 8-bit microprocessor and was a big leap forward. Another device that came out in 1972 was the first video console, and it had the snappy title of the Magnavox Odyssey. Now listeners, I strongly advise you, if you haven't already googled this product, to have a look at this. There's videos that show it. It hit the market in September 1972, and it really paved the way for the entire gaming industry. It was this white, black and brown box, and it connects to the television set. It had 2 rectangular controllers attached by wires, and it was capable of displaying these 3 square dots and 1 line of varying heights on the screen in a monochrome black and white, with different behaviours for the dots depending on the game that you were playing. But what I love about it is that players had to place these plastic overlays on the TV screen to display additional visual elements for each game. It's a brilliant product. Have a look at this. It's so old school. Atari was also founded in 72, and they released Pong in November of 1972, which was the first commercial game, and it became a huge hit. And again, for the uninitiated, Pong is basically like this 1D ping pong game, where the players are hitting this ball over and back to each other, and the ball can also bounce off the walls. It became a massive hit. Also in 1972, the HP 35, the first scientific pocket calculator, was released. Now, Osborne's, I suppose, not superpower, but he had a talent, a knack for breaking down complex ideas and making them accessible. And in 1975, he wrote and published a book called An Introduction to Microcomputers. It was a huge hit, sold over 300,000 copies. Remember, this is at the 1975. Personal computers were only at the start, really, and it had a big impact on Bill Gates. He cited it as one of the books that influenced him. And by 1977, Osborne Books had released more than 40 computing titles, and in 79, Osborne sold his company to McGraw-Hill for $250,000. But he stayed on in a leadership role, and he also managed to negotiate a deal that allowed him to pursue other projects on the side. And of course, this set the stage for his next big project, and that was the Osborne Computer Corporation, which he founded in 1981. He put $100,000 of his own money into it, and then he also got $40,000 from venture capitalist Jack Melcher. I didn't know about Jack Melcher, but I looked him up, and he was a very, very key figure in the early days of Silicon Valley. And he is credited with either starting or financing over 100 companies. Now, what I love about Osborne, what I really like about him, is he had this unique approach to business, something that he called his adequacy philosophy. So, as he put it, I give you 90% of what most people need. The idea wasn't to build the most advanced machine on the market. Instead, it was about giving people what they actually wanted, but without worrying about perfection. Like, he openly described his first computer, the Osborne 1, as a machine whose performance is merely adequate when compared to the competition. And you see, this philosophy, it was unique, and it was a direct challenge to the rest of the computer industry, which was always chasing the highest specs and the latest features, whereas Osborne's focus was on accessibility, making computers affordable and usable for a much larger audience. And his claim that good enough is enough, this 90% mantra, it really offended Steve Jobs' sensibilities. Here's a quote from Steve Jobs at the time. He said, "This guy just doesn't get it. He's not making art. He's making shit." But of course, Osborne didn't want to make art. He wanted to make affordable, accessible computers. And on April 3rd, 1981, Osborne released his first product, the Osborne 1, at the West Coast Computer Fair. And the Osborne 1 was groundbreaking for a few different reasons, but the two biggest ones were portability and price. Now, it was the first portable computer, I'd say, but the term portable might be a bit of a stretch because it weighed 24 pounds or 11 kilograms. But it was designed to fit under an airline seat, which was revolutionary at that time. He also priced it at $1,795, about half the cost of other computers. And the Osborne 1 was the first computer to bundle software with the hardware. It came with a word processor, spreadsheet, database, programming languages. These were all tools that were worth about $1,500 on their own. So you kind of wonder, how did he manage to pull this off? Well, he was very clever with his negotiations. He used his industry connections, of which he had built up many over the years. He also had a lot of charisma, and it allowed him to work out deals that let him bundle software affordably. And one of the most important deals he did was for the CP/M operating system, which was a big program back in the 80s. And Osborne managed to negotiate what was called a universal perpetual license from the manufacturers of that operating system for just $55,000. And now this fixed cost meant that the more Osborne's ones he sold, the better the deal worked out. Because, if he sold 1,000 of them, then it was only costing him $5.50 per package, essentially. He also focused on, as we mentioned before, adequate software. So, in other words, software that was good enough to get the job done, but not necessarily the best, which helped keep costs down. And this bundling strategy, it really disrupted the industry because software used to be a big money maker for companies. But Osborne, he flipped the model on its head by packaging the software with the hardware. Now, other things about the Osborne that I love, it was an all-in-one system. It had this tiny 5-inch display, and again, Google it. But this very small display, it came with a modem, but it did also offer an optional 11-inch external monitor. Its specs included 64 KB of memory. Now, at that time, 64 KB wasn't considered generous, but it was considered good enough. But by today's standards, it's minuscule. For comparison, most mobile phones have 64 gigabytes. That's 1 million times more memory than the Osborne 1. But for 1981, the Osborne 1 was cutting edge. And as a result, sales took off like wildfire. Thanks to its portability, its low cost, its bundled software, orders skyrocketed from 8,000 in 1981 to 110,000 in 1982. So their revenue in 81 was 5.8 million. In 1982, it jumped to 68.8 million. They were manufacturing about 10,000 units a month, and they had 3,000 employees on the payroll. Now, Osborne himself, with this newfound reputation and success, he liked to party. Journalists who visited his house noted that he loved to show off his fancy cars and houses. He threw lively parties, and he projected an image of a fun-loving tech tycoon. He really revelled in his success, and it reflected also his personality. He's been described as gregarious, very proud of what he achieved. He was also a very animated storyteller, and he could mix industry with other topics that he was interested, like libertarian politics. But those close to him also said that he rarely opened up about his private thoughts. So again, one of these charismatic guys that's very outgoing, but you never really get to know what he's like. But he was also a very polarizing figure. He even admitted it himself. He said, I quickly became the guy everyone wanted to watch slip on a banana skin. And it's true. I mean, there were plenty of reasons why people in the industry wanted to see him fail. I mean, first of all, there was his personality. He was brash. He was outspoken. He made bold statements. And he rubbed people up the wrong way. He admitted as much in 1982, interviewing the New York Times, where he said, I'm very self-confident, insufferably so. At the West Coast Computer Fair in 1981, he said the following to his competitors. He said, do as I have done or perish. So he wasn't exactly subtle. And at that same event, some young Apple engineers were going around, and they saw all the crowds at Osborne's booth, and so they wanted to check it out. And Osborne spotted their Apple badges, and he grinned and declared, oh, some Apple folk, go back and tell Steve Jobs that the Osborne one is going to outsell the Apple II and the Macintosh combined. So Jobs didn't appreciate this, and apparently shortly after that, he called Osborne's office and left the following message with his secretary. He said, tell Adam he's an asshole. I mean, no offence to Jobs, but talk about the pot calling the kettle black. So Osborne's success, his confidence, his aggressive marketing tactics, they made him a constant thorn in the side of his competitors. And rightly so, they viewed him as arrogant, opinionated, dismissive, which he was. But admirers found him brilliant, inspiring, ahead of his time. Journalist Jack Schofield wrote that some saw him as arrogant, but I found him immensely charming. What I really like about Osborne, though, is that the way he didn't sugarcoat his own product. I mean, I had some quotes earlier on, but this is another where he said, we're producing a machine whose performance is merely adequate when compared to the competition. It's not the fastest microcomputer, it doesn't have huge amounts of disk space, and it's not especially expandable. I love the fact that he's not actually overselling his product at all. He's underselling it. And that's the key selling point of his computer, I suppose, ironically. But the problem with building a machine that's merely adequate is that it gives your competitors a very low bar of entry. And so improving on the Osborne one wasn't that difficult, and plenty of companies were lining up to take a shot at it. I mean, there was a company called K-Pro, I think that's how you pronounce it. They launched the K-Pro 2, which featured a more practical 9-inch display. And then, of course, IBM entered the scene with their IBM PC, and that was a move that shook the entire industry. So in response, in 1983, Osborne announced plans for the Executive 2 computer, but he announced it before it was anywhere near completion. And you kind of think, why did he do it? Well, according to Lee Felsenstein, the engineer who designed Osborne 1, he said the following about Adam Osborne. He said, his enthusiasm for the next big thing meant that Adam couldn't keep a secret. He just couldn't keep it in about their new offering. But it wasn't even close to completion. And the result, sales of the Osborne 1 completely collapsed. Retailers didn't want to stock the Osborne 1. Consumers started holding off their purchases, cancelling their orders, waiting for the Executive 2. The financial fallout was devastating. For months, the company had virtually no cash flow. They'd planned a stock offering to raise capital, but the sales collapse forced them to suspend it. It was a shit show. Now, people love to blame what's called the Osborne effect, for the sole reason that the company failed. Osborne pushed back on that. He was saying that it wasn't that simple. He pointed to a bunch of other problems that the company was having. I mean, there was internal politics and manufacturing issues. These are valid points. I mean, there was a serious clash between Osborne and his newly appointed CEO, a guy called Robert Jonick. And that led to a lot of infighting, political games within the company. And of course, that kind of tension doesn't make for good decision making or planning. There were also production and supply chain problems that slowed things down. And on top of that, the company's bookkeeping was a mess. For example, in September 1981, this is when the company was going gangbusters and taking off like the new time. Bank of America flat out refused to extend them credit as a result of poor accounting practices. So imagine your sales are going through the roof, your company is taking off, and your main bank won't extend you credit because your books are in such bad shape. And look, Osborne is right to point out these other issues. They may have contributed a little bit to the company's collapse, but they weren't insurmountable. Most startups have those kind of issues. The real killer here was the collapse in sales of the Osborne one, and that was triggered by Adam Osborne's premature announcement of its successor. And by the middle of 1983, the numbers were pretty grim. The company owed $42 million. Its assets were only valued at $15 million. It had gone through 5 rounds of financing. Each round just added more debt. And with no income from sales, the company was declared bankrupt in September 1983. Just 2 years into its very, very successful launch of the Osborne One with revenues of $70 million, it was gone. And when the company opened its book to potential buyers, the response was clear. A total of 160 interested parties took a look at buying Osborne out of receivership, and not one of them made a bid. So it was clear that either the development of the Executive 2 computer was far from complete, or maybe, which is probably more likely, the competitive landscape was such that prospective buyers didn't see any value in its completion. Because remember, IBM had entered the market by this stage. Now, Osborne later reflected in a book he wrote in 1984 called Hypergrowth, The Rise and Fall of the Osborne Computer Corporation, that he saw it as a lesson in the differences, I suppose, between being an entrepreneur and being a proper business person. He believed that entrepreneurs thrive on big ideas and on innovation, while a business person, they excel at managing operations and growth. And Osborne himself was very clear in admitting that he didn't have what it took to manage a rapidly scaling business. And I quote, he said, "I didn't know business, didn't understand finance." And this lack of experience in the nuts and bolts of running a company, it made it really hard for him to keep things on track during their hyper-growth phase. Now, post Osborne Computers, he founded a company called Paperback Software International, focusing on software, and their prime product was called the VP Planner. It was this budget-friendly clone of the popular Lotus 123 spreadsheet software, but Osborne priced his product at just $99, whereas Lotus's was $500. And when I said it was a clone, that's pretty much what it was, because Lotus sued Osborne's company, accusing them of copyright infringement. The case dragged on for 3 years, and during those 3 years, the sales of the software product collapsed by 80%. As I said, it took 3 years, and when the case was decided in 1990, the judge sided with Lotus, and Osborne had to close the company down. In 1992, Osborne founded Noetic Software, and this is where he turned his attention, interestingly, to artificial intelligence. The company focused on what was called neural networks and fuzzy logic. Now, I didn't know what fuzzy logic was, so I just looked it up. Fuzzy logic is an alternative way of computing that works with degrees of truth rather than the black and white of true or false. So very interesting. But that same year, 1992, Osborne's health began to decline. He was diagnosed with an organic brain disorder which caused a series of mini strokes, and his condition worsened, and he moved to southern India in 1992. And over the next decade, his health continued to deteriorate, and on March 18th, 2003, he passed away at the age of 64. Now, in relation to his legacy, John Dvorak, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, a columnist with PC Magazine, he called Osborne the perfect personality to become a dot-com billionaire had he been born later. Dvorak observed that Osborne had all the traits of the 1990s internet tycoon. He had bold vision, risk-taking, he had flair. But he pointed out that in the 1980s, those traits sometimes made him a misfit. He was ahead of the curve. Osborne's life was one of, you got to say, remarkable achievements and dramatic setbacks. Of course, his story is inseparable from the infamous Osborne effect. That's how I found out about him. But his vision for affordable, portable computing, his ability to anticipate consumer needs, that's saying something. That is some legacy. Plus the fact that he pissed off Steve Jobs more than anybody else back at that time. So kudos for that. And Osborne's story is most definitely, it's a great business story. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. And remember, if you have any comments, any corrections, or any story that you'd like us to cover, email us at info@gbspod.com. All the best, folks.